There are silences that do not belong to the present, silences that seem to come from beneath the earth, as if the ground whispers stories that no one taught, but that the soul remembers. And maybe you've already felt this, that strange, almost ancestral sensation that there is more beneath our feet than the maps dare admit. If you feel that certain things are no coincidence, maybe this video is what you needed to hear. Imagine walking along an ancient road in Europe and, without realizing it, you are walking on corridors that stretch for hundreds of kilometers, connecting cities, caves, temples, and civilizations that disappeared before they were even named, as if the entire continent had been stitched together by hands that knew not only the rock, but also a purpose that time tried to erase. Today, when we talk about 12,000 kilometers of hidden passages, we are not just talking about tunnels. We are speaking of memories carved underground, as if they were the spiritual backbone of a continent. And the most curious thing is this: these passages do not appear as isolated works, but as a recurring, almost universal trait, reappearing in countries that have never met, but who seem to share the same ancient memory, an underground map of intentions, fears, rituals, and survivals, as if the people who came before had built, in the womb of the earth, what they could not reveal in the light of day. Human beings have always gone underground when they needed to understand what that words couldn't reach. The cave has always been the first temple, the first uterus, the first portal, and it's impossible not to wonder why exactly in the heart of Europe so many tunnels were dug with such precision, purpose, and silence. What were you trying to hide? What did we try to preserve? Maybe these passages aren't just tunnels. Maybe they are testimonies. Maybe they are scars. Perhaps they are, even today, invitations, because every cave holds a question, and every tunnel asks for courage to be crossed. And that's where our journey begins. And you, are you ready to go down? When the first archaeologists began recording underground structures through Europe, many believed they were facing isolated cases, modified caves here, reinforced passages there, caves adapted for rituals or protection. But according to the maps were being overlaid, something unexpected emerged. A network, a continuous line, almost like veins running beneath the continent. The initial revelation was uncomfortable, because forced experts to accept that the European subsoil held more than caves natural, had human intention, and ancient intention, much older than the comfortable versions of the story were primed to fit. The idea that there would be 12,000 kilometers of hidden passages, distributed among regions that never communicated officially, seemed absurd at first glance. But each new finding reinforced the impression that we were facing a larger phenomenon. Tunnels that crossed centuries, cultures, and kingdoms, as if they obeyed the same civilizational impulse, a silent knowledge transmitted from generation to generation. And that gives us leads to a deep reflection. As such distinct peoples, separated by languages, geographies, and mythologies, would they create such similar structures? Who taught who? Or, who inspired everyone? From a spiritual point of view, it is impossible to ignore the recurrence of the underground path in European myths. From the Celts to the Germans, from the Alpine peoples to the Balts, the journey downward symbolized transformation, rebirth, crossing. Jung said that everything we bury, fears, memories, traumas, creates its own internal tunnels, demanding descent so that something new can emerge. Could it be that these physical tunnels spread across thousands of kilometers reflected the same psychological impulse, as if the continent was trying to understand its own collective shadows? Science, on the other hand, tries to explain passages from a practical perspective, escape routes, secret trade paths, hiding places against invaders, ritual bonds between communities. But none of this explains the scale. Nothing explains the continuity. Nothing explains the fact that in certain sections the engineering is so precise that it seems to defy the level technology attributed to the time. It's not just a functional work, it's an intentional work, as if someone, thousands of years ago, had decided to connect dots that today are not even we know how to locate completely. And this is where the contrast arises. Official history insists on fragments, while the land shows patterns. The Academy talks about coincidences, but the human soul recognizes repetitions when you see them. There are too many continuous lines, Too many repeated symbols. Silences too deep for everything to be merely casual. Maybe that's why so many researchers who dare to delve deeper into the topic face resistance, criticism, and even ridicule action. Not because there is a lack of questions, but because there are plenty of doors that some prefer to keep them closed. When we look at these tunnels, we're not just looking at carved stone. We are looking at a gesture, an ancestral, insistent gesture, engraved underground like a memory that refuses to be erased. And the question that arises is inevitable. What exactly these people were trying to preserve, or hide, beneath our feet? The answer may be closer than we imagine. It may not be only in archaeology but in ourselves, because every time something is buried, it is because it carries value, and every time something remains hidden for millennia, it's because keep the truth. If something inside you is awakening, stay until the end. The answer may be here, but before moving on, have you noticed that some underground structures in Does Europe seem connected to a period long before written history? That's what we're going to explore next. When we talk about Europe's megalithic tunnels, we are entering a layer still oldest part of this underground memory. In regions such as Scotland, Ireland, Germany, Austria, and as far north as Spain, excavations have revealed structures called Erdstelle, small, narrow corridors, sometimes only 40 centimeters wide, connecting chambers that appear to have been molded with extreme care. The most accepted dating points to the Middle Ages, but many archaeologists admit there are signs that the bases these structures may be much earlier, as if older people had started something that later cultures only expanded on or reused. And that's right there that the mystery gains depth. Why different civilizations would have followed the same underground thrust, carving such similar passages into the earth separated by thousands of kilometers. The initial revelation is always the same. No one knows for sure why they were made. There is no clear signs of habitation, no storage marks, no signs of defense military. The tunnels seem to exist not to house bodies, but to house meanings. And when something is built without an evident everyday function, this takes us to the dimension symbolic, one that speaks to the soul before speaking to the intellect. Maybe they were runners' rituals, paths of initiation, places where the individual had to bow, crawl, diminish, and then emerge, transformed. In many cultures, this physical gesture represented a spiritual rebirth, as if entering the womb of the earth were essential part of finding yourself again. From an emotional point of view, this pattern mobilizes something deep within us. When we imagine a human being from 1,000 or 10,000 years ago entering a narrow tunnel, guided only by the light of a torch that burns for a short time, we can feel the vulnerability of this act. The earth pressing down on your shoulders, the distant echo of footsteps, the smell mineral that predates the unknown. It's not just archaeology, it's an invitation to historical empathy. Long before leaving ruins, our ancestors left intentions, and intentions rarely lie. However, science tries to interpret these spaces based on logic, escape passages, temporary hiding places, places to protect religious objects. But the contrast is inevitable. If they were practical structures, why build corridors so narrow that they could barely? Do they allow an adult to pass? Why such specific curves, such small discrete entrances, as if designed for a mental ritual, not for everyday use? The more you study, the more it appears that these tunnels were of no use to survive. They served as a reminder. And here comes the twist. These passages always appear close to megalithic sites. Stone circles, burial chambers, astronomical alignments, as if the underground builders and surface architects were guided by the same map invisible. Perhaps the underground was the spiritual mirror of the sky, and each tunnel functioned as a bridge between worlds, the world of rock and the world of the star, the world of memory and the world of oblivion. This connection between the megalithic and the underground suggests something extraordinary. We were not only in the face of isolated structures, but of a continuous mentality, a culture that I understood that the internal path and the physical path were the same thing. And it is exactly. That's what makes these tunnels so unsettling. They do not appear as practical answers, but as questions. Questions left by hands we may never know, but that even today seem to touch our shoulders when we look into the darkness. And so, inevitably, we arrive at a question that pulses like a call. The that these very similar styles, repeated for centuries and separated by so many distances, were trying to preserve in common? In the next block, we will touch on an even more sensitive layer of this story, when the underground is no longer just an ancient vestige trail and becomes a secret guarded by orders that dominated medieval Europe. When medieval Europe began to build its cathedrals, castles, and fortresses, something curious remained invisible to ordinary eyes. Most of these structures also had secret underground passages, often unknown even to the people themselves, inhabitants of the time. And it didn't take long for these passages to be associated with orders that operated in the shadows, not out of malice, but because they carried spiritual, political, and symbolic responsibilities that could not be exposed to the light of day. Among them, none are as shrouded in mystery as the Knights Templar. The Templars officially appear as a military order, protectors of pilgrims and guardians of sacred places. But as his influence grew, his relationship with the underground also became more symbolic and more enigmatic. Excavations carried out in ancient Templar fortresses revealed tunnels that connected chapels, crypts, chambers, and meeting places, built with a precision that surprises even contemporary engineers. Nothing was improvised. Nothing was casual. It was as if the underground represented for them a second temple, a place where silence was more valuable than any sword. The most intriguing revelation is that many of these tunnels had no obvious military function. They were neither conventional escape routes nor strategic depots. In several fortresses, the access to the underground corridors began directly under the altar, a detail that reveals more about spiritual meaning than about any practical purpose. This gives us leads to an even deeper interpretation. What if these passages were used to rituals, initiations, or contemplative practices that required absolute recollection? And if the underground, as in ancient cultures, was seen as the womb of transition, the portal between the visible and invisible world? In emotional terms, thinking about this provokes something familiar. We all have our own hidden corridors, those internal places where we keep what is sacred, painful, or transformative. Jung said that the descent into the underground represents the journey to the unconscious, where we face both our monsters and our greatest potential, luminous. Perhaps the Templars understood this intuitively, that certain knowledge cannot be revealed ahead of time, which certain truths require silence before they become light. Historical science, in turn, tries to interpret this relationship with caution. Researchers point out practical functions, such as the need to protect valuable objects, document sensitive or spiritual relics. But the contrast remains. If the goal were just physical protection, why hide the entrances under liturgical spaces? Why design chambers that resonate acoustically as if they were made for whispered prayers? Why build tunnels that lead not to distant exits, but to empty rooms where only does the echo seem to survive? It is in this contrast that the turning point emerges. Perhaps the Templar tunnels were not useful for hide objects, but to hide experiences. It is possible that they were spaces for inner preparation, of ritualistic silence, of contact with symbols that could not be shown to anyone. And when we consider that many of these structures are connected to ancient megalithic sites, we notice something disturbing. The medieval order may have inherited and reinterpreted much older practices, as if he had received the guardian of knowledge that has traversed millennia through underground paths. This spiritual synthesis, which unites archaeology, psychology, and mystery, takes us to an inevitable question. What exactly were these orders trying to protect in the underground? And why did this knowledge need to remain hidden? Because in the next step of our journey we will dive even deeper, no only in the subsoil of Europe but in the subsoil of the human soul. Jung used to say that everything we leave in the darkness of the unconscious comes back to us as destiny. And when we look at the 12,000 kilometers of hidden passageways beneath Europe, this phrase almost sounds like an interpretative key, not just for understand the tunnels, but to understand the human being himself. Because, deep down, each civilization digs in the earth what it fears, what it reveres, or what it needs transform. And each person, silently, does exactly the same thing inside. Yes. When Jungian psychologists talk about descent, they are rarely describing a physical movement. They describe the moment when the soul turns inward and inevitably you encounter what you have avoided for too long. The shadow, the past, the repressed impulses, the unanswered questions. The underground, in this sense, is not just a geographic space. It is a universal archetype. And when looking at these tunnels, Europeans, so ancient and so numerous, we have the impression that each of them is also a mirror of the internal journeys of its builders. The revelation, then, happens almost effortlessly. Distinct peoples, separated by centuries, excavated paths in the earth that evoke exactly the same image that Jung described when talking about the journey of the soul. Narrow tunnels that force the body to bend over, cameras where the sound changes, where the breath echoes, where the silence amplifies, secret connections between distant points, as if the underground were an emotional map that crosses continents, and even more profoundly, hidden entrances, as if the sacred only could be accessed by anyone willing to diminish themselves in front of it. In emotional terms, this is powerful because we all recognize this movement. At some point in life, we are led to pass through internal corridors, so narrow that it feels like the world is falling apart. These are phases of transition, of loss, of change, of rebirth. Phases that ask for courage to enter and even more courage to remain. And in some ways, these ancient tunnels remind us that our ancestors also faced their own labyrinths, not just those on Earth, but of the soul. Science tries to explain this journey in another way. Scholars talk about symbolism universal, of behavioral patterns repeated over the millennia, of structures, internal aspects of the human psyche that transcend time, geography, and culture. All true, but there is an inevitable contrast. Even with all the rational explanations, something in these tunnels escape what can be measured, because the feeling of going down, of crossing the darkness, of returning, transformed, this belongs to the human before it belongs to the historical. And it is at this point that the turning point comes. The European underground is not just a record archaeological, is a psychological reminder. Jung stated that every spiritual journey requires, first of all, an encounter with the shadow. And looking at these 12,000 kilometers of hidden corridors, it does not seem an exaggeration to imagine that all of Europe, as one great organism, went through this same collective journey, as if each tunnel was an artery deep leading to the heart of the continental unconscious. In the end, we can summarize all this like this. Tunnels exist outside of us, but they talk about what exists within us. They reveal that all of humanity carries from the beginning the impulse to hide, protect, or transform that which cannot be seen in the light of the day. And as we walk these corridors, we realize a silent truth. No one goes underground and comes back the same. Neither did ancient people, neither do we. And then the question arises that takes us to the next step, whether these tunnels reflect the human unconscious. What happens when we compare these ancient passages with the great underground cities discovered in recent centuries? When we talk about underground cities, Europe seems to wake up from a long sleep geological, because suddenly we realize that what we considered an exception is actually standard truth. The entire continent seems to have been pierced by hands that knew not just the rock but the silence. In Portugal, under ancient castles and churches, archaeologists find galleries that connect wells, crypts, and ancient cisterns, as if each stone held a secret route that only time could hide. In Malta, the Hal Saflieni Hypogeum, an underground complex more than 5,000 years old, reveals chambers that resonate at specific frequencies, as if the air itself had been carved to transform the consciousness of whoever breathed there. And in France, catacombs and historic tunnels extend for kilometers, far beyond what the official maps admit, suggesting that the Parisian underground is just the surface of something even bigger and older. The revelation is always the same. None of this seems accidental. None of this seems improvised. There is engineering, there is purpose, there is intention, and there is also a pattern that repeats almost uncomfortably. Many of these places show signs of having been built on older structures, as if each generation inherited not only the land but also its hidden corridors. It's as if the European underground were a book written in layers, where each civilization left a sentence, but few understood the full meaning of the text. From an emotional point of view, imagining these places provokes something almost intimate. Why we're not just talking about dark tunnels and cold rocks. We are talking about spaces where thousands of people, over millennia, walked with purposes that perhaps we will never know. We're talking about entire cities hidden beneath the surface, such as the monumental Derinkuyu in present-day Turkey, a cultural bridge between Europe and Asia, where more than 20,000 people lived underground, with impeccable ventilation, deep wells, circular stone doors that could only be moved from within. Derinkuyu is not just an architectural feat. It is a pun people that the underground was once home, protection, temple, and refuge. Science tries to interpret these constructions as pragmatic responses to wars, invasions, persecutions. All of this is plausible, but it doesn't explain what's behind the sensitive, mathematical, and almost organic engineering of these spaces. Why build chambers with perfect acoustics? Why create such complex passages that even today require maps? Why keep entrances hidden under chapels, fireplaces, and wells? There is an evident contrast. Practical use seems to explain part, but does not explain the whole. There's something there that escapes the eyes of conventional archaeology. Perhaps a spiritual heritage, perhaps a knowledge that has not been recorded, perhaps an intention deeper than survive. And this is where the turning point comes. When we compare these cities with the tunnel's older megalithics, we see a continuity. They are not isolated structures. They are chapters of the same underground story, as if the whole of Europe had inherited an ancestral instinct to descend, hide, transform, be reborn. The underground, whether prehistoric or medieval, it always seems to hold something that the surface world does not. It was ready to load. The synthesis, then, becomes clear. The European subsoil is not an accident. It's a mirror. It's the deep memory of a continent that, over millennia, found on Earth a womb, an archive, and an altar. And when we look at these constructions, an inevitable question: if all this was built to protect something, what exactly could this something be? And it is this question that takes us to the next block, the one in which the underground stops being only a human work and begins to touch the territory of secrets that no one dared register. There comes a time in any investigation when the question changes shape. No, at first we want to know how these tunnels were dug, then when, then by whom. But when patterns begin to repeat themselves, when epoch structures different spaces reveal the same calculated silence, the same architectural care, the same habit of hiding entries, sealing chambers and erasing records. So the question inevitable is another: what exactly was hidden, and why? The revelation that emerges at this point is uncomfortable. Not everything that was buried under the Europe was made to survive. Some things were made to disappear. In discrete excavations carried out in England, Germany, Portugal, and even Poland, archaeologists report corridors sealed with carefully fitted stones, as if someone had decided that nothing should ever pass through there again. In some cases, there are evidence that these sealings were made in different historical periods, as if several generations, separated by centuries, had silently agreed to maintain certain closed places. This is no coincidence. This is intention. From an emotional point of view, this pattern awakens a familiar uneasiness. All of us. We know what it means to hold something so deeply that we forget where it is. We know what it's like to bury painful truths, protect fragile memories, hide wounds that were not yet ready to be seen. Maybe civilizations will do the same. Perhaps Europe buried things that were not dangerous but sacred, or perhaps they were dangerous precisely because they were too sacred to be manipulated. Science, in turn, tries to fill in the gaps with practical hypotheses: caches of war, secret routes, ritual sanctuaries, deposits of valuable objects. But the contrast persists. There are not enough traces of military use. There are no signs of hidden treasures. There are no explanatory inscriptions. Silence is absolute, and absolute silence is rarely accidental. It is as if what these tunnels hold is not a what, but a why. What? As if the true reason lay in the intention that guided centuries of excavation, use, transformation, and concealment. It is at this point that the most disturbing turn of this journey appears. Perhaps the underground European Union is less of an archive and more of a mirror. Maybe what was hidden is not an object, but a knowledge. Something transmitted by megalithic people, reinterpreted by medieval orders, preserved in ritual chambers and protected by geography itself. Not a secret you can see, but a secret you can feel, the kind that touch human beings where they still have no words. And the synthesis imposes itself almost alone. Everything indicates that what was buried under Europe is not, it's just history, it's memory. A deep, shared, perhaps older memory than any recorded culture. A memory that crosses generations like a whisper underground that insists on coming back whenever someone digs deep enough. And then, the final question arises, the one that prepares the heart for what is to come. What if what we call a tunnel is just the surface of something that much deeper, something that was not hidden from humanity, but protected for them? It is this question that leads us to the final block. There are moments when the journey takes us to a point where we no longer seek answers, but understanding. And when we contemplate these thousands of kilometers of passages hidden beneath Europe, we realize that perhaps the true mystery was never the underground, but what it awakens in us. Because every descent is first of all a return to the oldest layers of human memory, return to the questions that have accompanied humanity since before language, a return to the silence that precedes any revelation. The final revelation, then, lies not in archaeology but in the soul itself. These structures, subterranean spaces, seem to exist to remind us that there are parts of us that also live hidden, preserved, waiting for the right moment to emerge. And when we look at in these tunnels, we realize that each civilization left there not just stone but intention, not just technique but meaning, not just darkness but an invitation. It is impossible to go through such a journey without realizing that the underground is not just what's below, is what's inside. And perhaps that is why so many cultures, so many times, and so many peoples insisted on digging it, protecting it, hiding it, as if they knew that everything that is sacred passes through the shadow first, as if they understood that nothing truly valuable is born into the light without first being stored in the womb of the earth. And so, when we emerge from this path, we understand something simple and profound. Some mysteries don't exist to be solved. They exist to help us transform as we seek them. If this message touched something for you, subscribe and follow us. There are paths that only can be walked in company. And before you go, allow me to leave you with one last question, the one that remains echoing long after the silence. What if what we call the end is just the beginning of a tunnel that the soul always did you know how to cross?